On December 21, 1943, First Lieutenant Leon Crane, a 24-year-old co-pilot from Philadelphia, climbed into a B-24 Liberator bomber at Ladd Field near Fairbanks, Alaska. The mission was routine, a high-altitude test flight to assess engine performance in the brutal Arctic cold. The crew numbered 5 experienced airmen. They carried standard survival equipment, maps of the interior, and full confidence in their 4-engine bomber. Within 3 hours, 4 of them would be dead. By the time the sun set that evening, Leon Crane would find himself utterly alone in one of the most inhospitable environments on Earth, with temperatures plunging to 40 degrees below zero. What followed was not a story of heroic triumph, but of relentless, grinding endurance across 84 days that would test the absolute limits of human survival. And Leon Crane was not a wilderness expert. Born on August 5, 1919, he grew up in Philadelphia, a city boy who knew streets and buildings, not forests and rivers. He joined the Army Air Corps during World War II and trained as a bomber pilot, learning to navigate by instruments and stars, not by reading animal tracks or finding edible plants. His experience with cold came from heated cockpits at altitude, not from sleeping on frozen ground with nothing but a silk parachute for warmth. He had never hunted. He had never built a fire to save his life. He had never been truly, profoundly alone. The Alaska interior was about to teach him all of these things, whether he was ready or not. The B-24 Liberator was a 4-engine heavy bomber, a workhorse of the Allied air campaign. On that December morning, the aircraft climbed steadily through the thin Arctic air, reaching 25,000 feet above the vast white silence of Alaska's interior. Below, the Charlie River Valley carved through mountains blanketed in snow, a landscape so remote that entire mountain ranges remained unnamed. The crew wore heavy flight suits and oxygen masks. The cabin temperature hovered near freezing despite the heaters. Pilot Second Lieutenant Harold Hoskin occupied the left seat. Crane sat to his right. Behind them, Master Sergeant Richard Pompeo served as flight engineer. First Lieutenant James Seibert handled propeller systems. Staff Sergeant Ralph Wenz operated the radio. They were conducting feathering tests on the propellers, routine procedures designed to ensure the engines could be shut down and restarted if necessary. Around mid-morning, one of the 4 engines malfunctioned. The propeller began to windmill uncontrollably, creating dangerous vibrations that shook the entire airframe. Hoskin and Crane struggled with the controls, fighting to maintain altitude and heading. The plane lurched violently. Instruments spun. The bomber began to spiral, pulled by forces no amount of pilot skill could overcome. Centrifugal force pinned the crew against bulkheads and seats. The world outside the windscreen became a sickening blur of white and blue. Hoskin sounded the alarm to abandon ship. In the chaos, Crane managed to clip on a parachute and stumble toward the open bomb bay doors. The cold struck him like a physical blow as he leaped into the void. Behind him, the B-24 continued its death spiral. Crane floated down through frigid air, watching the bomber strike a mountainside in a massive explosion of red and orange flame. The blast echoed across the valley, then faded into silence. When his boots hit the snow, he sank hip-deep into powder. The temperature was 40 degrees below zero. He called out repeatedly, "Ho! Ho!" his voice swallowed by the immense quiet. No one answered. He was alone on the side of a mountain overlooking the Charlie River, surrounded by spruce forest and snow-covered peaks that stretched to every horizon. The December sun hung low in the sky, providing barely 4 hours of weak daylight. Night was coming, and with it, temperatures that would drop even further. Crane took stock. He had no food, no sleeping bag, no rifle, no map or compass. The parachute still tangled around his legs. As in his pockets, 2 small boxes of wooden matches, and a Boy Scout knife. That was everything. The crash site burned briefly on the mountain above, but the fire consumed any supplies that might have helped him. The wreckage was unreachable, blocked by cliffs and deep snow. He made a decision that probably saved his life. He began moving downhill toward the river below. To stay still was to freeze. So he walked. The Alaskan interior in December is not a place that forgives mistakes. It is a landscape carved by glaciers, shaped by permafrost, and ruled by cold that can kill an exposed human in hours. The Charlie River Valley sits inside what is today Yukon-Charlie Rivers National Preserve, a roadless wilderness of boreal forest and tundra stretching across millions of acres. In 1943, the nearest settlement lay more than 100 miles away. No roads penetrated this country. No trails existed except those made by caribou and wolves. The river itself, a tributary of the mighty Yukon, flowed beneath a thick crust of ice. Snow accumulated in drifts 15 feet deep. Spruce trees grew stunted and black, their branches heavy with frost. This was a place where the sun barely rose in winter, where silence became absolute, where cold settled into bones and stayed there. Crane stumbled through the snow until exhaustion forced him to stop. He found a large spruce tree and began digging beneath its branches, creating a small shelter from the wind. Using handfuls of dry twigs and dead spruce needles, he built a fire. His hands shook violently as he struck match after match. Finally, a tiny flame caught. He fed it carefully, adding larger sticks, then branches, then logs he broke by stamping on them. The fire grew. Heat radiated into his makeshift camp. He wrapped the silk parachute around his body and huddled close to the flames. That first night, he did not sleep. He could not afford to. Every 2 hours, the cold woke him. He would unwrap himself, fetch more wood, build up the fire, then rewrap himself like a silkworm in a cocoon, and doze off again. This ritual continued through the endless darkness. For 9 days, Crane remained at that first camp. He had no food, only water melted from snow in his hands near the fire. Hunger became a constant companion. He dreamed of steak, mashed potatoes, and milkshakes. He dreamed of his family in Philadelphia, of warm rooms and soft beds. But when he woke, there was only snow and cold, and the spruce tree above him. Yet he tried to hunt. Using his knife, he fashioned a crude spear from a branch. He made a bow and arrows. He built a slingshot. The squirrels that chattered in the trees skipped easily away from his clumsy attempts. He had no experience hunting, and the animals seemed to know it. After 9 days of eating nothing, his strength began to fail. His hands and feet grew numb. Frostbite crept into his fingers and toes. He knew rescue was unlikely. The plane had crashed in the middle of nowhere. No one knew where to look. If he stayed by the tree, he would die there. On the 10th day, Crane abandoned his camp and began following the Charlie River downstream. He reasoned that rivers led to civilization, that trappers or miners might have cabins along the waterway. Walking was agony. The snow was deep and unstable. What he broke through the crust with every step, sinking to his knees or deeper. His frostbitten feet felt like blocks of wood. His hands were useless claws inside improvised mittens he'd fashioned from the parachute silk. He could manage perhaps a mile each day before collapsing in exhaustion. But on the first day of his journey, after hours of struggling through snowdrifts, he saw something that made his heart leap. A small, snow-covered cabin. The cabin was barely large enough to hold a narrow bed, a small table, and a cast-iron stove. But inside, Crane found a cache of supplies that seemed like a miracle. Canned food lined a rough shelf. There was sugar, powdered milk, flour. A .22 caliber rifle leaned in the corner with a box of ammunition. Canvas tents lay folded beneath the bed. And most precious of all, a pair of moose-hide mittens. The cabin had been built by Phil Burrell, a tough old trapper and miner who worked trap lines along the Charlie River. Burrell stocked his cabins with emergency rations, understanding that this country killed careless men. Within minutes, Crane had a fire roaring in the stove. He melted snow for water and made a steaming cup of hot cocoa with the powdered milk and sugar. It was the first food he'd consumed in 9 days. He wept as he drank it. Crane stayed in that cabin for more than 6 weeks. It became both sanctuary and prison. The structure leaked cold through gaps in the hand-hewn logs. Wind whistled and moaned through the chinks. With only 4 hours of daylight each day, darkness dominated his existence. The cold woke him almost every 2 hours. He would unwrap himself from his parachute cocoon, fetch more wood from the pile outside, and rebuild the fire, then return to a fitful sleep. His routine became monotonous and essential. Wake, tend the fire, melt snow for water, eat a small portion of the rations, check the rifle, wait for daylight, tend the fire again, sleep. Every day the same. Every night the same. The isolation pressed against him like a physical weight. He used the rifle to hunt ptarmigan, white-feathered Arctic grouse that gathered in the willows near the river. The first time he fired the gun, he missed. The second time, he missed again. Shooting a moving bird with iron sights and cold-numbed hands proved far more difficult than he'd imagined. But hunger sharpened his focus. He learned to wait until the birds were close, to aim carefully, to squeeze the trigger rather than jerk it. When he finally brought down his first ptarmigan, or the small body felt substantial in his hands, he plucked the feathers, roasted the meat over the stove, and ate every scrap, including the organs. It wasn't enough to fill his stomach, but it was protein, and protein meant strength. The cold was relentless. During the coldest nights, temperatures plunged to 50 degrees below zero. At those temperatures, exposed skin freezes in minutes. Breath crystallizes instantly into clouds of ice. Metal tools become brittle and dangerous to touch with bare skin. The cabin's thin walls provided minimal insulation. Crane piled all the canvas tents onto his bed and slept beneath their combined weight, wrapped in his parachute with all his clothes layered on his body. Still, the cold invaded. His frostbitten toes turned black. His fingers cracked and bled. He tended these injuries as best he could, as knowing that infection meant death as surely as freezing. Psychologically, the isolation wore him down in ways that hunger and cold could not. There was no one to talk to. No voice but his own. The silence of the wilderness became oppressive, broken only by the crack of shifting ice on the river, the occasional cry of a raven, or the distant howl of wolves. He began speaking aloud to himself, narrating his actions as if there were an audience. He talked to the fire, to the rifle, to the ptarmigan he hunted. It was a way of maintaining sanity, of confirming that he still existed. At night, lying awake in the darkness, he thought about his family, about Philadelphia, about the world that continued without him. He wondered if anyone was searching. He wondered if they had given him up for dead. By early February, Crane understood that waiting in the cabin meant slow death. The rations were nearly exhausted. The ptarmigan had grown scarce, driven away by his hunting. Winter showed no signs of breaking. If anything, it deepened. Rescue seemed impossible. No planes had flown over. No searchers had appeared. If he was going to survive, he would have to walk out himself. The decision terrified him, but staying terrified him more. He prepared methodically. He built a crude sled from branches and rope, loading it with the remaining food and supplies. On his first attempt to haul the sled, he realized it was far too heavy and clumsy to drag through the deep snow. He abandoned it and repacked a smaller bundle that he could carry. He took the rifle, ammunition, matches, the moose hide mittens, some food, and his parachute. Everything else stayed behind. So on a cold morning in early February, Crane left the cabin and began walking downstream along the frozen Charley River. Progress was measured in yards, not miles. The river's surface was treacherous, covered in snow that hid patches of thin ice and pressure ridges that blocked his path. He fell repeatedly, crashing through crusts into hidden holes, soaking his clothes in freezing water. Each time he had to stop, build a fire, and dry his clothing before hypothermia took hold. This process could consume hours. Some days, he managed only a mile or two before exhaustion forced him to make camp. He shot ptarmigan when he could, but often went days without seeing game. Hunger became his constant state, a gnawing ache that never left. The landscape was beautiful and merciless. Frozen waterfalls hung like sculptures of ice, though mountains rose in jagged silhouettes against the pale sky. The river twisted through canyons where wind howled like a living thing. At night, when the aurora borealis danced overhead in curtains of green and purple light, the cold intensified. Crane built fires in the shelter of spruce groves, using his parachute as a windbreak. He slept in snatches, always waking to feed the flames. His body adapted slowly, his metabolism burning whatever fuel remained, his mind growing numb to the suffering that had become routine. In early March, after weeks of walking, Crane found another cabin. This one was occupied. Albert Ames, a trapper, lived there with his family. When Crane knocked on the door, the family stared at the apparition that stood before them. A man with a 2-inch beard black as coal, hair long and matted, covering his ears and hanging over his forehead almost to his eyes. His face was sunburned and wind-burned. His eyes stared from the centers of 2 deep black circles. He was filthy, emaciated, and barely recognizable as human. But he was alive. Inside, Crane told his story in a halting voice. He described the crash, the 9 days without food, the cabin, the long walk down the river. Ames listened with growing astonishment. No one survived this country alone for that long. It simply didn't happen. But here was proof standing in his cabin, warming frozen hands by the stove. Ames's wife prepared a meal of pancakes and moose steaks. Crane ate slowly, his shrunken stomach unable to handle much at once. For 2 days, he rested in the warmth, regaining a fragment of his strength. On March 9th, Ames mushed Crane by dog sled to Woodchopper, a mining camp along the Yukon River. There, a bush pilot from Wynalaska Airlines agreed to fly him to Fairbanks. On March 14th, 1944, 84 days after the crash, Leon Crane landed at Weeks Field in Fairbanks. Word spread like electricity through Ladd Field. Half the officers on the post rushed to the cafeteria where Crane sat, still wearing the torn and blackened clothes he'd worn since December, putting away food with quiet determination. Men crowded around him, asking questions, staring in disbelief. That night, the base commander placed a long-distance call to Philadelphia. Crane's family answered the phone. At first, they couldn't believe it was really him. They had received notification that he was missing and presumed dead. Now he was talking to them from Alaska, his voice thin and distant but unmistakably alive. But in October 1944, Crane led a recovery team back to the crash site. They flew over the wreckage and landed nearby, then hiked through the same terrain Crane had descended alone. At the twisted remains of the B-24, they found the bodies of Lieutenant James Seibert and Sergeant Ralph Wenz, still inside the aircraft. No trace of Master Sergeant Richard Pompeo was discovered. He had parachuted from the plane, but vanished without a trace in the wilderness. Pilot Lieutenant Harold Hoskin remained missing as well. The team buried Seibert and Wenz at the crash site, marking their graves with rough crosses fashioned from spruce logs. More than 60 years later, in 2006, bone fragments believed to be Lieutenant Hoskin's were recovered by a military recovery team. He was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery, but Crane spent several days recovering under medical supervision at Ladd Field. His frostbite injuries were severe, but not life-threatening. He had lost significant weight. His body had consumed its own reserves to stay warm and mobile. Doctors marveled at his survival, noting that everything had gone right by the narrowest of margins. Had the cabin not existed, he would have starved. Had the matches gotten wet, he would have frozen. Had the river not led to Ames's homestead, he would have walked until he collapsed and died. Survival, they concluded, was less about skill than about persistence in the face of impossible odds. Leon Crane returned to Philadelphia after the war ended. He did not speak often about his ordeal. When pressed, he described it factually, without embellishment or self-aggrandizement. He became an aeronautical engineer and worked for Boeing, helping to design early helicopter systems. He married Wilma Coerson and raised 6 children: Stephen, Thomas, William, David, John, and Richard. His survival story remained largely unknown outside military circles for decades. He lived quietly, working, raising his family, going about the ordinary business of life. The wilderness had tested him beyond any reasonable limit, and he had endured. That was enough. There was no need to make it anything more. In his later years, Crane occasionally reflected on those 84 days. He described the monotony of isolation, the grinding nature of cold that never relented, the small victories that accumulated into survival. He spoke of the cabin as salvation, of Phil Burrell's foresight in stocking emergency supplies, of Albert Ames's kindness in taking him in. He credited luck as much as any action he took: the parachute that became his sleeping bag, the matches that stayed dry, the trail that led to rescue. These were not heroic choices, but fortunate circumstances. Survival, he suggested, was often less about what you did than about what didn't go wrong. Leon Crane died on March 26, 2002, at the age of 82. He is buried in Pennsylvania. His obituary made brief mention of his World War II service, but said little about Alaska. To his children and grandchildren, he was not a hero or survivor of legend. He was simply their father and grandfather, a man who had lived a long life marked by work and family. The wilderness had shaped him, certainly, but it had not defined him. He carried those 84 days quietly, on a private knowledge of what he had endured and what it had cost. Today, the wreckage of the B-24 Liberator remains on the mountainside overlooking the Charley River, inside Yukon Charley Rivers National Preserve. Visitors occasionally hike to the site, leaving flags and memorials to honor the fallen crew. The National Park Service maintains a historical marker describing the crash and Crane's survival. Phil Burrell's cabin still stands along the river, a weathered structure slowly reclaiming itself to the forest. It is a place of silence and memory, a testament to the thin line between life and death in the far north. Leon Crane's story is not a tale of conquest or dominance over nature. It is a story of endurance when all other options were exhausted. The Alaska interior did not care about his survival. It offered no assistance and showed no mercy. He persisted not because he was exceptional, but because the alternative was unacceptable. Every fire he built, every mile he walked, every frozen morning he woke to face another identical day. These were not acts of heroism. They were acts of necessity. And in the end, necessity proved stronger than cold, stronger than hunger, stronger than isolation. The wilderness took 4 men on December 21, 1943. It allowed 1 to leave. That is the mathematics of survival in a place where human presence is tolerated only briefly, where cold rules absolutely, and where the margin between life and death is measured in matches, in footsteps, in the flicker of a fire that must not go out. Leon Crane survived not by defeating Alaska, but by refusing to quit when Alaska demanded it. And in that refusal, in that relentless forward motion through 84 days of winter darkness, he wrote a story that endures, not as triumph, but as testament to what human beings can withstand when there is no other choice. If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you rethink what survival truly means, please take a moment to like the video. It really helps the channel reach more people. And if you want more true stories of human endurance against impossible odds, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.